bit of a difficult talk for obvious reasons. It's a complex period. Many of you would know that this is probably the last time that we would be able, historically, in historical terms, to provide something that looks like a unified narrative of Jewish history. Those of you who've done my talks on the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, like for example the 16th and the 18th century, which I've done in 4 separate talks in this room, each talk is a look at the entire century, but from a different perspective. And it's not a unified narrative that can simply work chronologically. And even the second half of the 15th century, which we're going to look at now, is struggling to contain all of the different elements. I'm going to talk about quite a number of elements tonight in the themes I want to point to, but there are unfortunately some things I won't be able to discuss. And perhaps it's a shame that I didn't make this a 4-part series without realizing, but you don't realize it until you actually get up and say, okay, well, we're going to talk about this. And I realized, oh, what about that? And what about this? I won't, for example, really tonight to be able to discuss some of the very important things that happened at the end of the 1400s. Don't open your mouth like that. It's not like I'm not going to talk about the Spanish Inquisition. You can all calm down. At the end of the 1400s, which happened in Eastern Europe, and I know it would surprise you because things have been going kind of okay in Eastern Europe till now, but at the end of the 1400s, we start to see massacres and expulsions a la the pattern already in Poland and Lithuania. Those communities are going to get rebuilt in the 16th and 17th centuries and become amazing communities, but before that happens, the origins of those communities undergo various levels of trauma, and I can't really discuss that, as well as some other issues and individuals even that I would like to touch upon, but we will find that we have a lot to talk about to begin to understand this talk. Now, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, this talk is being recorded twice. I'm hooked up with 2 microphones, let alone what nonsense you've got going on here. But I'm going to say some I'm going to say some things that are really quite out there, but which, as a student of history, need to be brought to the fore because we need to understand the mindset of what is going on in the 1400s. And so we came out from last week with really quite a depressing ending, as we did the week before. We came out with, we've had enormous massacres in Spain, we've had the debate at Tortosa, we've had massive conversions of enormous numbers of Jews right across the Iberian Peninsula. It's just been awful. At the same time that we've had, and I touched upon this last week, even though it's almost too painful to touch upon, still more expulsions, more massacres going on throughout the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and so on, and it's all looking very, very bleak. One could understand why by the time we come into the 1400s and the early decades of the 1400s, having been through all of that bleakness, that some people are starting to think, well, when's this going to end? How long's this going to go on for? Yep. And in fact, maybe we're meant to end it. We're meant to end it ourselves. How do we do that? How do we do that? And there's no other way to put this. Magically. Magically. Now, in order to understand what that means, in order to understand the couple of figures I just want to start with so that we can really get our heads around this, and it's not an irrelevant business. And in fact, it will very soon become highly relevant, as I will explain to you. We first of all have to understand that the 1400s is already moving into a world that is going to be very different from the previous centuries. In fact, it's going to be different from anything that's come before, because we are headlong towards an intellectual, cultural, artistic and social movement called the Renaissance. And I know that intellectual themes and the evolution of history in terms of ideas may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I'm here to tell you that ideas move history. Marx would not agree. Marx would say material conditions move ideas. But I'm still enough of a Hegelian spark in me to say that no, I think that ideas really are the engine behind history. And the Renaissance is not our topic per se tonight, but it's going on in the background. And some of you would be familiar with some of the big figures from the Renaissance. If we were to think, for example, certainly by the time we get to the end of the 1400s and the beginning of the, well, when we're in the full explosion of the Renaissance in the early 1500s, we've already got Michelangelo, we've got Leonardo da Vinci, and we've got, not necessarily seen as a Renaissance figure, but still very important, we've got Copernicus, and we've got a whole shift in knowledge and ideas, especially in art and so on. And part of that is a very, very important scholastic effort that is being carried on in philosophy. And it is during the 1400s, that people like Marsilio Ficino are finally able to separate out all the different strands of the philosophy of the ancient world. And ancient ideas is really what the Renaissance was interested in reviving. They did really see that everything basically between the Greeks and themselves was a kind of dark ages, and they were rebirthing humanity, literally, and going back to these ancient wisdom texts in philosophy and in mathematics and in art and so on. But during the Middle Ages, that had all been quite a bit of a cholent. Aristotle and Plato had all become mixed up together. And people, scholars like Ficino in the 1400s, especially after, and I'm going to come back to this because everything, another difficulty of this talk is that everything is interwoven, is that some of you would know that in the middle of the 1400s, Constantinople, which had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for 1,000 years, falls to the rising Ottoman Empire. That means that suddenly all these Christian scholars living in what was now the Ottoman Empire are coming back, fleeing to Europe and bringing with them all of these treasures and texts. And so finally scholars in Italy and elsewhere are able to say, oh, well, let's have a look, let's sort it out. Now, if you were an intellectual in a Jewish intellectual in the 1400s, even if you were a rabbi, you were a philosopher. You remember that big debate that I spoke about at the very beginning of this course on philosophy or not philosophy, the famous debate with the Rashba and so on? Philosophy has won that. The idea that it is ideal for Jews to study secular thought, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, as well as Talmud and Bible and so on, is now pretty much standard, and we have some tremendous figures who are able to combine both. Figures who, to give you an idea, would be the equivalent of someone who was a professor of astrophysics at MIT at the same time that they're writing a commentary on the Bible using 21st century philosophical ideas. Sorry? Shai Leibovitz is a kind of example, but Shai Leibovitz is already living in the 20th century when there are so many different disciplines. It was still possible in the 1400s to claim that you basically knew all there was to know. That's no longer possible by the 20th century, but then it was still possible. What opportunities were left for people that didn't like philosophy? As we looked at, there were people that didn't like philosophy. They didn't like the idea that innate religious, spiritual, Jewish ideas were being wedded to the Greeks. What opportunities were there for you? The only intellectual discourse in the 1400s that was really going to match philosophy as an explanation of things was Kabbalah. And as we saw with the revelation of the Zohar at the end of the 13th century already and the spread of Kabbalistic ideas, some people were getting heavily into that. And within the world of Kabbalah, you could be a theosophical Kabbalist. That's still a distinction today, by the way. A theosophical Kabbalist, meaning that you look at Kabbalah as a way of understanding the relationship between the divine and humanity and the Jewish people and the Torah and all of those things on a very metaphysical, quasi-philosophical level, which has unbelievable insights and spiritual transformations, or you could be a practicing Kabbalist. That is, you could be dabbling in Kabbalistic magic, and the use of, by the 1400s, what that generally meant was the utterance and use of divine names, subject for a separate talk, but we didn't really go down the whole Abulafian line that emerged in the 1200s, which deals with yogic techniques and meditations and so on. The people doing practical Kabbalah in the 1400s were very ooga booga, and they were using divine names to manipulate reality. So these people are the ones that are saying, well, to give you an example, Moshe Bottarell was a Kabbalist. He wrote a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah. Moshe Bottarell was a rabbi who had been at Tortosa, who was one of those who realized that we're fed up with this, watched half of Spain's Jewry convert, just the massacres, the debates, the pressure by the church, the financial restrictions, the expulsions and so on. And he's going, I know how to put an end to this. We need the Messiah. I wonder who the Messiah could be. Oh yeah, it's me. And he obviously announced himself as a Messiah. I will be covering Moses Bottarell in a series later this year I'm doing at the museum on the history of the Messianic idea in Judaism. He's a very interesting figure. And why he's an interesting figure is that he's not only a kind of a practicing Kabbalist going, no, 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 but he's also a philosopher. Very unusual combination for someone to be a practical Kabbalist. Normally someone who had a choice not to do philosophy would do theosophical Kabbalah, but he's a practicing Kabbalist at the same time that he's welding that onto rationalist Aristotelian philosophy. But the figure that is really interesting in the 1400s, just on this small topic of trying to bring about the end of all this tzoros, is a chap called, very, very mysterious, and when his name is mentioned, it's always in whispers. I'm not going to whisper it, I'll talk loudly so you can hear. But it's a very, is Yosef de la Reina. Anyone heard of Yosef de la Reina? Well, let me tell you about him, because it is absolutely fascinating. Quite a bit of research been done on him. Some of the aspects of his life are a bit vague, but his thought and his career are the subject of much speculation. Because Yosef de la Reina, and not alone in this, by the way, but he's the big name that we know of, decided, or came to the realization that what was actually causing all this evil in the world? In one. Christianity. Hello. Who's massacring us? Who's expelling us? Who's forcing us to convert? Christianity. Christianity is a metaphysical force in history that can be defeated by magic means. Because we know, and this is very, very important, because in the 1400s, not just in the realm of Kabbalah, but in other realms as well, people are really starting to think about history and what history means and what forces are at play in history. And those forces perhaps have cosmic reference in other realms. And there is a Kabbalistic belief, if you are immersed in this type of Kabbalistic thinking, and there were plenty in the 1400s, an understanding of a tradition that we have, that every nation and every ideology in the world has an angel that represents it in the heavenly court. Some of you would be familiar with that idea. And the angel representing Christianity is, of course, a manifestation of Esav, of Esau. And the Messiah will only come, by the way, just on the subject of Moshe Bottarell, who I spoke about before Joseph de la Reina, turns out he wasn't the Messiah, but he did send letters to everybody, every rabbi in Spain, saying, I can answer all your questions. Elijah has appeared to me, I'm the Messiah. But just those of you who are wondering how that story ended. But with Joseph de la Reina, it's more hardcore. Because the guardian angel of Christianity has to be transformed, not to be the enemy of the house of Jacob, but the protector of the house of Jacob. They knew that for the Messiah to come, a world has to come about whereby Christianity no longer persecutes Jews and the Jewish nation, but protects them against Islam. Joseph de la Reina affected, and we don't exactly know what he did, and most people think that he failed. But us living now in the 21st century, I'm not so sure. In the generation, 2 generations after de la Reina, the Roman Catholic Church itself undergoes a massive split and reformation that leads on to the modern period, that leads to the ensuing centuries, that leads ultimately to the church's complete repositioning on the Jews, and enter stage left America, modern Europe, the West, who suddenly turn Christian countries into defenders of the state of Israel against Islam. In general terms, there's always going to be people that write letters to the AGN saying I'm wrong, but in general terms. So who are we to say that de la Reina failed? But de la Reina has gone down in history across Kabbalistic literature as someone that you don't want to emulate, because terrible things happened to him as a result of his dabbling in these powers. He was used as like a boogeyman warning for Kabbalists. In fact, by the 16th century already, some Kabbalists were blaming de la Reina for the whole disaster of the expulsion. Not only did it not save the Jewish people, it created more misery. So it's very interesting that when we look at these things from a much later perspective, we can see them a little differently. But de la Reina is very interesting. And then, on the other hand, there are people who went deep into philosophy. People like Avram Ben Shem Tov Bibago, who wrote a very interesting book, I haven't got time to go into it now, called Derech Emunah, The Way of Faith, an attempt to try and take, a little bit like what Maimonides was doing a few hundred years earlier, but now with the full force of the 1400s and modern knowledge and so on, and these recovered texts which have been re-edited and reproduced, to understand how the Jewish faith and Jewish values are completely consistent with the values, the philosophical and sublime values that the Renaissance is trying to promote. In fact, it represents the height of it. Once again, an idea that's been around in the Jewish world for a while, all philosophy is really just leading to Judaism in its purest form. And what's interesting also, someone like the rabbi actually wanted to talk about was Rav Yitzchak Arama. Because Rav Yitzchak Arama, who learnt a lot from Bibago's Derech Emunah, is actually taking the same philosophical concepts and he's turning them into Parshanut. Everybody familiar with the concept of Parshanut? Parshanut is commentary on the Torah. So these figures in the 1400s are using these philosophical ideas not just to write independent books about philosophy, but to actually comment on the Torah and to use not only science and not only philosophy, but also history. And to start to show, once again, maybe not Kabbalistically, maybe more philosophically, that history is an important science of its own that teaches us a great many things. And all of the travails and exiles and movements of the Jewish people start to tell us things that enable us to have a clearer understanding of what is happening in the Torah, and that's the basis of their commentary. Yitzhak Arama's commentary on the Torah, the Akedat Yitzhak, was going to be very, very influential, especially on later figures we'll talk about, but on Yitzhak Abarbanel, everybody who was a decent, self-respecting intellectual in the 1400s and the 1500s was writing a commentary on Torah as the summation of what they wanted to do. Beforehand, commentaries on Torah were more written by people that were involved in the process of Jewish texts. And even those philosophers in the preceding century, like the Ralbag, who were also writing commentaries on Torah, they weren't necessarily integrating it in the way these ideas, together with history, were being integrated in the 1400s. But I've got to tell you, that distinction between Kabbalists and philosophers notwithstanding, we're all very proud, a lot of nachas for their families. But I've got to tell you, despite all the tzoros, and it would be no surprise to you to find that not every Jew was a philosopher, that there was one thing, one profession which had a kind of unbelievable bubble around it. That you could carry on this profession at the highest levels, unimpeded, whether you were in Spain, whether you were in the Holy Roman Empire, whether you were in the Papal States, sitting right under the Pope's tuchus, or whether you were in the Ottoman Empire, or whether you were in the Mamluk Empire, every single power in the world agreed on one thing, and that is Jews make good doctors. If you look at the court of every single one of those powers that I said, you will find a Jewish physician. The Pope had a Jewish physician. The Holy Roman Empire had a Jewish physician. Even Ferdinand I, the father of Ferdinand II, who we'll talk about, definitively had a Jewish physician. They all had Jewish physicians. In fact, the 1400s is really the rise of that whole concept, because where were Jews going to learn medicine? The idea of it, I mean, we'd had some very, very august universities already existing for a couple of hundred years. They were teaching divinity, of course, but they were teaching theology. Some had started schools for medicine. Medicine was becoming a bit of a thing. It was going to become big in the Renaissance as we start launching back into anatomy and start to understand the body. Oh, where were Jews going to pick this up? Now, one of the interesting facts about the Middle Ages, and certainly this is becoming a pointed fact already by the 1400s, is that ironically, as I just mentioned, one of the safest places for Jews to live, safe in relative terms, were the Papal States, because the Pope had enough power to be able to carve out his own conditions for his own Jews, and wasn't necessarily subject to some of the whims. Plus, we're going to have to talk for a minute about the very, very special place of Venice throughout the 1400s, which was rising not only as a mercantile power, but as a cultural power. And Venetian Jews had a very, very privileged position wherever they went, because Venice was doing deals with all sorts of powers, even the Ottomans. And therefore they need their Jews to be unmolested in all these other places. Venetian Jews had a kind of special citizenship, but the Papal States generally, not totally, but generally speaking, Jews were safer. A pope like Boniface IX at the end of the 1300s, beginning of the 1400s, exceptional tolerance for Jews. Jews in the Papal States in the very early parts of the 1400s, were doing really, really well. They were free in commerce. Many of the restrictions that had been placed upon them by earlier popes and earlier authorities were removed. And what we see in 1409, the University of Padua is going to allow Jews to come to Padua to study medicine. Already they're recognizing Jews make good doctors, and we want them qualified like our other doctors so they can be good qualified doctors. And from the first graduates at the University of Padua, Jewish graduates in medicine, start emerging from the 1409 onwards, and then throughout the 1400s we're just seeing Jewish doctors everywhere. Now, so much so, and so important to Jewish doctors become, if you're a physician to a court, because you're the physician of the emperor or the sultan or the pope or whoever it is, that means that you're very close. You're touching the body itself. These people rely on you and they trust you. And when they chat with you, if you've got a good bedside manner, when they chat with you, it's not just their health you're fixing. They're talking about their own sorrows, and you're advising them. And very soon they're going, oh, you're a bit clever. And if you can't fix it, you have a cousin who can, and a brother-in-law who knows someone in another town who can. That leads to toleration for Jewish communities, but it also means that some of these physicians were involved, eventually became effective representatives of the entire Jewish community to these major power figures, and in some ways were determining the course of history, not just for the Jewish world, but for some of the momentous decisions that were taken in the 1400s. So we need to understand how not all Jews were oppressed. Venetian Jews were not, on the whole, and physicians were reaching positions of tremendous influence. And we'll see that further. I think some other figures we'll talk about who were physicians. In other words, if we don't state it specifically, any Jew I talk about is a philosopher and a physician. Even the Jews who weren't practicing medicine, studied medicine, that was the thing. That was your ticket. And since we're talking about Italy, really, it's all happening in Italy. It's all happening in Italy. The Renaissance is an unstoppable force. The greatest rabbi in Italy during the 1400s, someone that you probably may not have heard of, Rabbi Yosef Coton Trabuto, who we know is the Maharik. Just an indication of how important and prestigious and influential Italy was becoming was the fact that the Maharik was able to send letters to communities all around the world demanding acceptance of his authority and advice. Whether those were the greatest rabbis in Germany or the greatest rabbis still in Spain or elsewhere. It's important to understand he had also a kind of a personality that would lead to that. When he heard about a problem, he didn't hold back. We're talking about figures who are in the last generation, really, of major halachic authorities of the period that we would call the period of the Rishonim. These are the last authorities that are going to end up being mentioned by the Bet Yosef in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And his contemporary, the one I mentioned before, Rabbi in Italy, Rabbi Judah Messer Leon. Amazing philosopher and an amazing influence on the environment around him. And of course, those two had a complete falling out, such a falling out that they were both evicted from Italy, unfortunately, towards the end of their respective careers. It's clear to understand the Maharik was a huge scholar in Torah and as far as he's concerned, nothing mattered except obedience to religious ritual and its proper observance. And Messer Leon, Messer, by the way, meaning he got a knighthood. He actually got a knighthood from the Holy Roman Empire, emperor himself, from Frederick III, probably due to some kind of medical procedure he would have done for him. He's not famous as a physician, but, you know, a visiting Jew, I'm sure you could fix me up, and he does. And he's knighted. And we're going to talk about this again in a few minutes. The fact is that during the Italian Renaissance and during this period, Hebrew texts are becoming more and more interesting to scholars. As the Renaissance is turning to ancient world texts and ancient world wisdom, it's not enough that we go around burning things. We want to find out what they say because it's very important to us. The Jews may well have a perennial wisdom, besides which the Bible itself, which we are kind of interested in, is written in Hebrew, and who's going to teach us that Hebrew if not these Jews? So Hebrew starts to become a renewed subject in the 1400s, and Hebrew texts. And therefore, people like Rabbi Judah Messer Leon are incredibly essential in that process, because they're not going to go to Chaim Shmerel sitting in some smelly corner to learn Hebrew. They want to learn Hebrew by someone who baths once a month and has a, you know, philosophical outlook and can talk Aristotle and Plato with them and so on. Yeah? But I got to tell you, things are happening in the world. You know, we can talk about Italy and we can talk about Italian Jewry and its amazing contribution. And once again, these are only headlines. I'm mentioning a few people, but there are a lot. As Jews, due to the tolerance in the Papal States at this stage, are making to this, but in the background. Every respecting Christian scholar of the Renaissance had rabbis and Hebrew scholars that they spoke to and accessed. So we are at the absolute forefront of these changes. But they're not the only things going on in the world. And as you would know, in 1453, which is a moment that us sitting here in North Caulfield in 2020 doesn't feel particularly acute, but I can tell you it was a big event in world history, inevitable, but nevertheless a big event, and that is the fall of Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire had kind of snuck in. People hadn't been noticing that this entity that started as a small kingdom basically in northwest Turkey, Anatolia as it was known, was gradually growing until it started to encompass very big tracts of territory and was becoming extremely powerful until eventually it was able to conquer the capital of Byzantium and end the Byzantine Empire, which had been founded pretty much about 1,000 years earlier in the split of the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. It's a very, very big moment. Just as we saw that big moment we talked about where really, or we're going to talk about actually, the end of the 1400s, the last little bit of Muslim Spain is going to fall in Granada, then that's only within a few decades of the last little Christian bit of the Muslim world falling to the Ottoman Empire. Eventually the Ottoman Empire is going to go on to expand even more. The land of Israel and all the Middle East will come under their control in the early 1500s and so on. But for now, this is important. And the attitude of the Ottoman Empire to Jews was, of course, very, very different from what they had experienced under Christian rulers. The Ottomans, I mean, I wouldn't say they were dancing around singing Hava Nagila, but they were pretty undiscriminating. If you had talent, and especially if you had money, and you had ideas, and you were prepared to contribute to the Ottoman Empire's welfare, then go for it. Okay, so you can't build a shul higher than a mosque, fine, and you can't do this and you can't do that, because at the end of the day, you're Jews, but far, far greater freedoms. And one of those things was that now we have a rabbi who is chosen by the Turkish authorities, by the Ottoman Empire itself, to be the Chacham Bashi, to be the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire. That position is going to continue, and that's established already in the 1400s. Okay, you got Jews, you need a chief rabbi. And the first person to really be appointed by the Turkish government was a rabbi called Chacham Bashi. To get the first title, Chacham Bashi, was a Rabbi Moshe Kapsali. Moses Kapsali. Fascinating figure. Of course, ended up in a massive conflict and machlokas with Yosef Katon Traboto, who alleged, based on information that he'd received, that Kapsali was lax in the administration of very important Jewish rituals like divorce and conversion. As you know, those issues have never left us. There is still that kind of discussion in the world today. Those rabbis don't know what they're talking. I saw a letter this week, exactly. Those rabbis don't know what they're talking about. They're not doing it properly. We have to go and fix it up. And exactly the same from here. But this time, instead of saying, yes, rabbis will, no. Now, the Ottoman Empire and its Jews are not going to take just any Italian rabbi telling them what they can and cannot do. And it ended up being a very, very fierce disputation of the 1400s that ended, by the way, with Rav Yosef Katon Traboto admitting that he was wrong and that he had wronged Rav Kapsali, the Chacham Bashi, and on his deathbed sent his son to Kapsali to seek forgiveness on his behalf. We're not talking about small figures here. These are very, very high-level people. But what we're looking at is the thematics of how the power balance in the Jewish world is kind of shifting as these new entities arise. Jewish communities are international, but they are regarded as they are expected to be loyal to the powers in which they find themselves. But I know there's a topic you're all waiting for, and I know that we need to talk about this, because if I don't talk about this, you'll go away and you'll go, well, I can't believe it. He spoke for over an hour on the 15th century, in the second half of the 15th century, and he didn't talk about this. I've got to tell you, there was a dye merchant living in Avignon, in France, a Jewish dye merchant called David Caderus. And David de Caderus almost changed history, but he didn't. Thank you, I thought that was funny. He got into a deal, we know because we've seen the contractual evidence and historians done a lot of work on this. He got into a deal with a goldsmith, a non-Jewish guy who was a kind of a artisan in gold, who had developed a movable type, creating letters out of metal effectively for the purpose of being able to produce text quickly. And Caderus figured that this is already in the 1430s. Caderus reckoned he had an idea about how he could turn that into something that could produce text very, very quickly. But we don't, and they made a deal. He would give him the thing, in return for which he would teach him Hebrew, and that he would allow him to help him to create Hebrew letters and so on. It was a whole deal matter, but we don't know what happened to it. We don't know what happened to that deal, and David Caderus did not become the great inventor of printing that we would have perhaps liked him to have become. He did not become the inventor of the printing press as perhaps was his dream. That opportunity was left for a non-Jew who you've all heard of called Johannes Gutenberg. And he works out that he's able to create a press system. Some of you will know even better than I do the basic mechanics of how a printing press works, but together with movable type, which had been around for a little while, and this new invention called the printing press, which he was able to cobble together some existing technologies and really perfect it so that he could create books a book very quickly. And already in 1455, 20 years after Caderus, 1455, he is producing what we now know as the Gutenberg Bible, which is the first real hard copy evidence of the dawn of the information age. Latin. But people can say, oh well, a Latin Bible produced by a German printer. And sometimes we need to stand back. People think, oh well, you know, Jewish history, really, Christian Bible, 1455, what a shame, we didn't invent the printing press, they did, da da da. And then when you take a step back, you realize that if you look at Jewish history as a whole, we gave the world the Bible. So in a sense, the fact that the Bible is the world's first printed text, with all due respect to the Chinese, don't tell anyone they'd been printing texts already for hundreds of years, but don't tell anyone that. But the first, you know, dawn of the information age was effectively, in many ways, a Jewish text. Is still quite incredible and part of our unique journey in the world. But while the Christian scholars and priests and authorities were debating about whether the printing press was a good thing or a work of the devil, Jews wasted no time. Text. We love text. A way to produce text even more faster than our parents could have possibly imagined. Seriously, make no mistake. The first 20 years of the printing press is only matched by the first 20 years of the internet that we all went through. The printing press was utterly revolutionary. If you had a massive library, a massive personal library before 1450, and scholars talk about very glowing terms, like you should come and see my library. I've got 70 books. By 1500, within the first half a century, the period of printing, the period that we refer to as incunabula, meaning that it's prior to 1500, it's after the invention of printing, but prior to 1500, there are millions of physical books now circulating around Europe. The Jews wasted no time. We actually were a bit slow by our standards. We weren't slow in setting up these printing presses, but, you know, there's issues to think about. Not everyone's going to be happy with certain books. It takes time to get Hebrew type together. Things have got to be done carefully. Jews don't like books being sloppy. We have to market, distribute, and so on. So by the time we get to 1500, Jewish presses have produced about 100 titles. Okay? Which doesn't sound like much, but it's astonishing. It's absolutely amazing, given the numbers of Jews, that what we are producing, and there are probably by I'd say by the 1490s, there are maybe 12 or 15 printing presses existing, mostly in Spain, well, in Spain before the expulsion, and the dominant place of printing in that very, very early period of Hebrew printing was Italy. And the very first book that was printed, and when we say this, we're not 100% sure because we think things were printed before, but we don't know unless a work is dated. But the very first dated Hebrew work, in other words, we made this in 1475, is a Chumash with Rashi's commentary. Produced where? In Italy, in Reggio de Calabria, in the south, became the birthplace of Hebrew printing. It was a Chumash with Rashi produced by Abraham Garten. Sorry? The printer was Abraham Garten. He probably came from Spain. We're not entirely sure about his origins, but we imagine that he emigrated there from Spain. A lot of Jews in Spain saw the writing on the wall, weren't going to stick around for another 20 years or so and wait to be kicked out under the most unpleasant circumstances that we will talk about. There had been already a leak of Jews. The thing about the Papal States is, and the thing about Italy is, and I did talk about this in the 16th century as well, very, very difficult place for Jews to get into unless you had ready cash and a lot of it, or you were in some way aristocratic or linked with high levels of protexia. You weren't going to be able to live in the Papal States, even in Jewish communities. They were pretty much a closed shop. But if you got in early enough and you were fresh and you had a bit of money, a bit of talent, you could make it happen. And Garten was one of those. So by the 1470s, he's already got a printing press up and running, and he produces the first dated book, a Chumash with Rashi. Now, for Rashi's commentary on that book, Garten said, I mean, remember, it's not like he's got 500 years of printing behind him so he knows what he's doing. All these things are, I don't really know what I'm doing, but it seems to work. He says, I'll tell you what, I want something that's going to be clearly able to distinguish what is the text of the Bible, the Torah itself on the page, the text of the Chumash, and what is going to be the commentary of Rashi. So he develops his own typefaces for the Rashi commentary. A particular adaptation of a Sephardic cursive script that he quite likes, and that is what we today call Rashi script. The whole legend that Rashi was writing in some secret handwriting because no one would let it, nonsense. Besides which, it's perfectly legible. It's just a slightly different font. But what became universal as Rashi script until today, that all commentaries basically are written in that script, originates from the very, very first Garten's very, very first edition. But as I can tell when I look at this room, Garten's name is not the one that people think of when they think of the origins of Hebrew printing. Most people would be familiar with the much bigger printers that came out shortly after, and particularly Sonsino. Well, Bomberg's more the next century, early in the 1500s, but you'd be talking about people like Gershon and his son Joshua Sonsino, who went on. Now, I've got to tell you, just as an aside, one of the reasons why the name Sonsino is familiar to many of us, because we're all familiar with the great project of translations into English of the Talmud, the Midrash, and the Zohar that was done in the 1930s, in the 20th century in England, by the Sonsino Press. You know what I'm referring to? So a lot of people go, oh, Sonsino, look how long they were going. No. The guys who set up the Sonsino Press in the UK in the 1930s just took the name Sonsino and called it Sonsino Press. It wasn't connected to the Sonsino family or the same printing press. It's very annoying that they did that because it'd be a brilliant name for a publishing company today. But they got it. And they even had the chutzpah to use exactly the same logo that the Sonsino, House of Sonsino used in the 1400s, that little brick lighthouse thing. All right. And in fact, they start really doing this in earnest and producing serious texts. So they are the first ones to print in 1483. They are printing a Haggadah, a printed Haggadah. I mean, sometimes we just don't realize how astonishing it is that, you know, the idea of a printed Haggadah is only 500 years old. printed Haggadah, and in 1492 they are producing the Mishnah and the Torah. The Torah, which had only been written 100 years before, 150 years before. These are seminal works in Jewish law, seminal works in Jewish culture, and we are pumping them out. There are some questions at the time about the status of these texts. Things that appear simple to us did not appear simple then because no one had done it before. What's the status of a printed text? What is it? Is it the same as if I write it on a cloth, like a parchment with a quill, like a proper sofer? Can I use my printing press to print mezuzot? Would they be kosher? I mean, the answer is no, but I'm just saying that at the time, I know the answer is no, because I live in the 21st century, but at the time, this was not clear. And what about the other way? What if I produce something printed? Does it no longer have the same level of sanctity that another work would have? So, and can I therefore, do I have to bury it? Can I burn it? You know, all these different issues were being sorted out as printing was changing everything. But for Jews, they're the questions they want to know. What is the actual physical status of these texts? And people wanted the texts, and they changed the Jewish world forever. We who live now, and I've said this before, in the last 30, 40 years of Jewish history has seen a golden age of Jewish publishing in so many ways. That was akin to what was happening then, because every time we see a major shift in the informational age from one medium to another, we see a tremendous revolution of knowledge. And this was revolutionizing knowledge on a major scale. Interestingly enough, none of those printing presses in the early decades of Jewish printing were in Germany. Even though Gutenberg was in Germany, Jewish printing houses were not simple things to set up in the Holy Roman Empire. You couldn't do that in Germany. There were a few in Spain. You're looking at me like, is that conflicting with information you have? No, we're good? Okay, just you stood up and you went up, and I thought, oh gosh, wow, he's descended from a long line of printers from Regensburg and he's upset. So, no, there weren't any in Germany at that particular point. It was all about Italy and a bit in Spain in the early years. And that kind of thing was having a tremendous effect and revolution on knowledge, not just in the Jewish world, but generally. Another amazing scholar, amazing in ways that we don't have time to talk about, called Eliyahu del Medigo, who got up one day in Candia, in Crete, which had a very, very respected and ancient Jewish community, and went to live in Venice and in Italy, and became a very, very important figure in the Renaissance. He became a figure in the Renaissance because he became known as a man of letters. Hebrew books are now starting to circulate, not just amongst Jews, but amongst non-Jewish elite intellectuals who are buying them. And one man comes to him and says to him, "Teach me Hebrew." And that man, we could make an entire separate lecture just on this person, Pico della Mirandola. The figure of the Renaissance, the intellectual Renaissance par excellence. And let me tell you just quickly about Pico. It's not my job to stand here and tell you about Pico. I'm not going to tell anyone that you don't know who it is. And we'll keep that secret between us. But I'm here to tell you that Pico della Mirandola is huge. And one of the reasons he's very big and figures in Jewish history is because he is one of these high-level proponents from the Renaissance who is arguing vociferously for the importance of the preservation of Jewish knowledge and the incorporation of Jewish knowledge into the wider Renaissance project. And he goes to Eliyahu del Medigo to learn Hebrew. So when I said that del Medigo becomes the Hebrew teacher of Pico della Mirandola, I thought you were all going to go, oh. But that's okay, you can still go, oh. Mirandola, however, he falls out with Mirandola because, as I said at the very beginning, Already the Renaissance is separating out between Aristotelian and Platonic thought. And Mirandola, like so many of other Chaverim in the Renaissance, is really trying to move away from Aristotle. Aristotle has been the big influence on the High Middle Ages, but people are starting to rediscover Plato and Platonic thought, and particularly Neoplatonic thought, which I have discussed when we've talked about philosophy, Jewish philosophy. We've understood those differences. And Mirandola comes along and he says, I've got Platonic thought and Neoplatonic thought coming from the Greeks, which is making me very excited. On the other hand, I've got Christianity, which is not only exciting to me, but it's also true. But how can I bridge those two? How can I get from Plato to Christ? Not the first person in history to ask that question, by the way. But his answer is unique. And he finds it in the Kabbalah. Because the Kabbalah also was rejecting Aristotelianism because of the whole Kabbalah philosophy debate, but embraced Neoplatonic thinking because Neoplatonic thinking is a fantastic thing for Kabbalah, because Kabbalah talks about emanations and Neoplatonism talks about emanations from the one to create this corrupt pluralistic reality that surrounds us, and therefore they are an ideal match. And all Mirandola had to do was put the final cog in, which is Christianity, and he creates Christian Kabbalah, which is going to be immensely influential in the whole intellectual development that happens not only in the Renaissance but going forward into the Enlightenment. These are very, very big ideas that are taking shape, all in the background, by the way, of the production of more and more Hebrew texts. And he falls out with Delmedigo over this very issue. I won't go on about it because obviously Pico della Mirandola is not someone that is exciting you, but I'm telling you, when you go away and you do a bit of reading and you come back and you go, oh, now, he's right, Pico della Mirandola. Completely indebted to Jewish thinkers for this incredible shift within the Renaissance, not only towards humanism, but towards understanding the writings and teachings of Judaism and Hebrew texts. But there are a lot of positive things, and those of you who know about the Renaissance and about the Jewish involvement in the Renaissance have to forgive me that I have to move away from there now, because we have things to deal with before the end of this talk that are very, very critical and important. And we've got to go back to Spain. Spain is not Italy. Spain's not going through that kind of humanist Renaissance. It might have an undercurrent that wants to, but it's not going to go there. Spain and Portugal have got other things on their mind. Basically 2 things, maybe 3. First of all, we have to understand, and really what would have been wise of me would have been to break this up into 2 separate talks, and the first of those 2 talks would have got us up to where we are now. So let's imagine we're starting a new talk. It's next week. Hello, everyone. We're going to continue, and I'm going to be now looking at Spain. And 1469 is the year, of course, of what was referred to then and is still referred to as the Shidduch of the century. And the Shidduch seriously, can anyone compete with that as the Shidduch? If you go through all the marriages of the 15th century, could you find a bigger, more influential, world history-changing one than that? No. The Shidduch of the century between Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, which effectively created a union between Aragon and Castile that was effectively the creation of Spain. Now, Isabella and Ferdinand were very different people. Oh, by the way, just as an aside, because that marriage, I highlight that year because a lot of people think, 1492, and that's what they know about. But that's not where, no, we're not here to deal with, primary school level headlines. We need to get a little bit below that and to see what's going on. 1469 is really a watershed year for Spanish Jewry because it marks the end of an idea that is loosely called, sorry? No, the Golden Age has basically been over since the middle of the 1200s, where it's 2 centuries beyond that. An idea that has come to be known as convivencia. Convivencia is what we might call multiculturalism. There's an idea that in countries like that, and in many other countries around the world, there's no reason why Christians and Muslims and Jews can't all live together. Yep. We even saw that, 100 years ago in Lebanon, for example, or we saw it in the Ottoman Empire, we saw it at various times, and we saw it in Spain. And that's the idea that, okay, sometimes the Muslims are in charge, sometimes the Christians are in charge, but that's the end of convivencia. And you're going, the end of convivencia after everything they've been through. You think that was convivencia? No, it wasn't really an ideal application of convivencia, what had gone on in the last 70, 80 years in Spain. But that was still the ideal. But that's put to an end by 1469. But take someone like Ferdinand II, Ferdinand and Isabella. As I said, Ferdinand's father, not exactly a friend of the Jews either, had a Jewish physician who had removed his cataracts and restored him to full sight from complete blindness. They understood the value of Jewish physicians. Ferdinand II had some very high-level Jews in his cabinet, not conversos, Jews, like Vidal Astori, who started as a silversmith and rose to positions of tremendous influence. These people were actually helping Ferdinand at various times change world history. They're the ones who were going to tell him, yes, we think it's a good idea to fund Columbus, or no, we don't. And if you look at the people surrounding Ferdinand, you would realize that half of them are Jews and the other half are conversos. There's barely a Christian there. But one of the great books of the Renaissance, a book you're all familiar with, at least by name, which is written by Machiavelli, called The Prince. His book, The Prince, is modeled on Ferdinand II. The man was a master politician. Thank you for not answering. A master politician. And although he may not necessarily have had a problem with Jews, was not exactly averse to treating them how they needed to be treated. He saw the Jews primarily as an economic issue, as so many power of kings did in the Middle Ages. Their economic policy. I could use them, enjoy the benefits of having them, but if I don't need them, I don't need them, and I won't lose any sleep over it. But Isabella, very different agenda and very different outlook. Isabella was religious. And Isabella's problem with the Jews was theological. And Isabella was not only religious, but she herself sought the company and consultations not of clever Jewish strategists and financiers and internationalists and philosophers. She sought the advice of some very heavy-duty Christian bishops and priests and confessors. And together, look, the thing is very, very complicated. Anyone in this room will know that it's difficult to stand on one foot and give over the Spanish Inquisition that led to the expulsion. Historians themselves have created an entire circus of theories to understand what led Ferdinand and Isabella to initiate the Spanish Inquisition in the first place. There had been inquisitions around of some sort, even by that name, already for a couple of hundred years. But this was a unique phenomenon where the Inquisition was not going to be conducted by papal nuncios and papal representatives authorized by Rome, but they were going to get one hechsher from Rome, one authorization from Rome, one single papal bull that would allow them to set up an inquisition that was authorized by the church, and after that, the entire project was going to be in the hands of the crown. It was going to be taken away from Rome, and with that authority, and administered directly. This was the Spanish Inquisition. And its aim was to purify Spain, and initially it wasn't aimed specifically at Jews who had remained Jews, unless they were seen as in some way assisting Jews who had converted to secretly practice Judaism. A term, a concept that has acquired the term morano, but we prefer to use the term anusim, which is a Hebrew term that has a much more immediate understanding. Anusim means those who are forced, literally forced. But the Spanish called them new Christians, or they called them conversos. And clearly, we can see it. The conversos were still the same people. Just because Chaim Shmerel goes and sticks his head in a baptismal font, and eats a piece of chazer instead of a gefilte fish, doesn't mean he's not the same person. And so, of course, that's going to create a huge economic threat, and yet we are supposed to treat these people as complete equals. They were doing well enough against us when they weren't even equals. Now they're equals, they're going to murder us financially. And that's what was happening. Jews were rising everywhere as conversos. Oh, you want to be a Christian? I'll be a Christian. Fine. Can I go to the bank tomorrow and do some deals? This is only one theory, of course, is the economic pressure theory. And so, but from Isabella, it's fairly clear, it's religious. Ferdinand was more interested, perhaps, in keeping some kind of order within Spain. At the end of the day, and I've got an eye on the time, and it's really incredible that we're only up to here, but I need to indicate this, the complexity of these issues. They bring in Thomas de Torquemada to take care of the Inquisition. They are burning people left, right, and center. It is horrendous. But we are still struggling on. And eventually, Torquemada says to them, Ferdinand and Isabella, so long as you have Jews in Spain, you're going to have Jews in Spain. And you know what you have to do. And really, the Jewish community of Spain, which had been there for like 700 years, was for hundreds of years had been the crown in the Jewish world, had been the most populous community, the most productive community for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a huge lesson for us all. It's a huge lesson for us all. We're given 3 months. 3 months, and you can leave, and you can take nothing, except maybe what you can carry, and it can't be anything too valuable. Now, historians, a lot of time on the numbers here, but basically I think historians are revising the numbers today to understand that given that during the course of the late 14th and early 15th century, so much of Spanish Jewry had already converted, and since of those quite a number had left, that the numbers have kind of been revised downward. It used to be upwards of 200,000. Now it's maybe more like a quarter of that. but it is still an immense number in terms of medieval Jewry. But 3 months means that you've got to sell up everything in 3 months, and everybody knows. So you're basically leaving with kadoches, and you've got nowhere to go. And so most Jews, of course, went over the border to Portugal. I'll deal with Portugal in a sec, but it was cataclysmic. I know, and let's be honest, sitting here in 2020, a lot of people think, well, okay, but you know, obviously it was terrible for some people, and lots of people died, and it was horrendous, because don't forget that, you know, where do you go? Where do you go? Where do you go? King John II allowed people to go into Portugal, but they had to pay a heavy tax, and they were only allowed to be there for 8 months in the initial phase, and afterwards they were enslaved, if you want to stay in Portugal. There were communities, we've just undergone some serious pogroms in communities in North Africa, in Morocco, which I haven't managed to speak about. Those communities are just reeling from that. They're poor community. What are they going to do with you? You want to go to the Papal States? Well, you need money, you need connections. Some did, but not for most. Maybe we need to stay here. So and not only that, travel was dangerous. Thousands of Jews died by pirates, by ransom, by this, by that, by shipwrecks, it's appalling. But some people say, well, it was bad, but it wasn't the Holocaust. First of all, we can't really compare events like that. I'm here to tell you that the expulsion from Spain was utterly cataclysmic in terms of the stability of the Jewish world, in terms of what it did for Spain. And perhaps the most pathetic and tragic story of it all, really, in some ways, not sure that's pathetic. I mean, it's very interesting to follow the careers of two extremely powerful Jews living in Spain, influential Jews living in Spain at that time. One is the last chief rabbi of Castile. The last chief rabbi of Castile was Don Avraham Señor. He wasn't just a rabbi, he was a communal leader responsible to the crown for collecting all taxations on behalf of the Jewish community, but also it's the chief rabbi of Castile, and an immense figure like Don Yitzhak Abravanel, who was effectively the treasurer. It's quite interesting because he was born in Portugal, but he had to flee to Spain from Portugal. As soon as he arrived in Spain in the 1480s, he rose very quickly and he became the effective treasurer of Spain. And yes, there are legends that Ferdinand and Isabella wanted him to stay as treasurer so much they offered that he could stay in Spain and they'd give him a minion and kosher food and so on. And he said, no, we're not sure how true that is, but we do know that Don Yitzhak Abravanel refused, obviously, to negotiate any position as far as his own personal faith was concerned. He's attempted with immense amounts of his own personal fortune and of that of the community to get the decree annulled. And then when they couldn't annul it, the Alhambra decree, which was the decree of the expulsion, when they couldn't get it annulled, to at least get it delayed, and they threw hundreds of thousands of ducats at it, and all they managed to get was a 2-day extension from the 31st of July to August the 2nd, and August the 2nd was Tisha B'Av of 1492. But perhaps the most pathetic picture of all that is that Rav Avraham Señor, already an aged rabbi, the last rabbi of Castile, said, I can't do this. And he converted. And when you hear that and when you read the accounts, you want to cry because you realize that this individual didn't convert because he wanted to, but he probably converted because of the hundreds of thousands of Jews that were going to stay in Spain who he knew would have needed someone that would act as some kind of legacy towards their Jewish past. These were very, very bleak and difficult times. Abravanel, of course, because of his connections and his wealth, managed to go to Venice, Naples. He spent out his last years in Italy, and he wrote a very famous commentary on the Torah. And in that commentary on the Torah, having suffered so many exiles and vicissitudes, he realizes that it's not about philosophy, is not where we're going to find God. We're going to find God in the revelation of history. History, Jewish history as it unfolds, particularly through its cycles of exile and renewal, is where we find the divine. This is a massive idea that has driven many, many insights into Jewish history ever since Abarvanel. Another huge spiritual idea about Jewish history emerging from the late 1400s. I haven't got time to go into Abarvanel. He's a massive figure, and I urge you to look into that, because I need to talk in the last 10 minutes. I just want to talk about someone else who is, I mean, you know, I would always talk about who I think is the brainiest person of each century. So this guy is hard to match. And I'm talking, of course, about Avraham Zacuto. When I say Avraham Zacuto, put up your hand if you know who I'm talking about. Yeah, good. Okay. So maybe 5 of us. And that's why I give these talks, so that these situations can change. Just like Abarvanel grew up in Portugal and fled to Spain, Zacuto grew up in Spain, but eventually was expelled to Portugal in 1492. But before that, well before that, Zacuto had become the greatest astronomer in Europe. No two ways about it. And wrote a book, his almanac, the Ibur Agadol, and the Luchot, which became the fundamental text for navigation that completely revolutionized and drove the whole age of exploration that the Spanish and the Portuguese were embarking upon and about to embark upon. It was, in fact, the translator of that, who was working at the court of the King of Portugal, who, of course, had a Jewish doctor, Vizinho, who had studied under Zacuto, and who introduced this, organized for this to be translated from the Hebrew into Castilian and into Latin. And even though he had argued against the Portuguese supporting Columbus, met Columbus and handed him these documents that then became the basis of Columbus's navigational expertise as he crossed the Atlantic. And as legend famously has it, we know he writes himself in his own diaries that he used Zacuto's tables, but they actually saved his life and the life of his crew in that very same famous incident where he's besieged by natives but was able to intimidate them by predicting an eclipse, that the moon, if they don't let him go, the moon would be eaten up, because Zacuto had told him that at that latitude there will be an eclipse. Now, I haven't got time to go into it. Students of astronomy will know this, but the brilliance of Zacuto and his ability. Remember, we talked about Yaakov ben Machir. I don't know if you remember, in the first talk we talked about his Jacob's staff, this navigational tool. Well, that then got developed by Zacuto into the full-blown astrolabe, and that allowed, but a new type, that allowed sailors to work out their position, because there are no latitudes, using the sun instead of the stars. Massive revolution in navigational terms, because they were in completely uncharted territory. And those are the tables, a Hebrew text that drove Columbus and enabled the whole age of exploration that discovered the New World. And not just Columbus, of course, because in 1497, which is already 5 years, I mean, can you imagine expelling a guy like Zacuto? As soon as he arrives in Portugal, they go, oh, Zacuto. And by the way, of course, Zacuto, there's a crater on the moon. Another, remember the Ralbag, Rabbi Levi's crater on the moon? The other Jewish crater on the moon is the crater Zagut. And as I've always said, if there's ever a Jewish state on the moon, it will have its capital there, because, you know, das ist Zagut crater. Immediately goes to Portugal and becomes the astronomer royal there. And it's not just a case of a third party accessing his texts. He directly trains Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama comes with his officers and his navigational crew to live in Zacuto's house for days while they learn his tables, his astrolabe, and his way of navigating and working out position. Because what was Vasco da Gama trying to do? He was not trying to get to the New World. He was going the other way. No one had worked out a sea route to India. That's what Columbus at first thought he had discovered, but he didn't. He discovered a whole new world called America. But it's very nice, America, but it's not India, where all the spices in Indonesia, all those things that are going to make us wealthy. And otherwise, we're dependent upon the Venetians and so on who were taking stuff overland. We want a sea route, but my gosh, no one's been around Africa. We don't even know if we can do it. Bartholomew Diaz got as far as South Africa, marvelous. But we need to know, can we do it? Vasco da Gama trains with Avram Zacut and uses directly his equipment and his skills and his science and opens up the whole trade routes via sea, joins the Atlantic with the Indian Oceans and arrives in India. Unbelievable. And as Vasco da Gama, and that's why that was the splitting of the world. Spain was going to take the New World and Portugal was going to have everything to the east. And unbelievably, as Vasco da Gama is arriving in India, or a little bit before. I mean, Zacut trains him in January, and they set off a few months later, and in a very short amount of time, he's expelled. I mean, imagine having someone like that and expelling them, but all the Jews of Portugal became expelled. I only have 2 minutes. The expulsion of the Jews of Portugal, one of the greatest and most awful swindles in history, just disgusting. Actually, I got no personal issue with the Portuguese per se, obviously, none of us do, but that was just an ugly, horrendous episode. They only expelled the Jews because Manuel I, King John's second successor, wanted to marry Isabella, the daughter of Ferdinand Isabella, and in the marriage document, they only agreed to give him their daughter if he expelled the Jews. Can you believe that? Portugal. So they expelled the Jews. But when the tens of thousands of Jews got down to the docks, what did they find? They did not find boats waiting for them. They found priests. You're not going anywhere. We're doing it differently. You're all Christian. The only way we will let you leave is with nothing. And that means, and listen to this, without your children. And your children will belong to us. The only difference, one of the other major differences between the Portuguese expulsion and the Spanish expulsion, still people managed to get out, and that's only because they said, rather than kick everybody out like Spain did, but the day after you have to be kicked out, everyone has to be a Christian, but we'll let you out. The Portuguese didn't let you out, but they said, we're not going to look too closely. We're going to give the Jewish community of Portugal 20 to 30 years to adjust. And we won't really introduce the Inquisition here for a couple of decades, and then we'll look closely. But you have 20 years to sort yourself out, but you can't leave. But obviously people left, and people did. They said, I'm no Christian, I'll go to another Christian country, I'll leave from there, wherever it is. People got out, but it was horrendous. That then led to massacres in Lisbon in 1506 and so on. These are topics that we can't go into right now. I need to finish up. And since I started with messianic ideas, the pressure of the Inquisition, the pressure of the expulsion, of course, caused all sorts of various cultural cataclysms. In 1500 is the prophecies of, since you like women, Hannah, the Inez of Herrera, what they call Inez, the prophetess, the maiden prophetess of Herrera. She was only 12 years old when she started prophesying, and she started having dreams about seeing the conversos being taken up into heaven. These things became a cult amongst the conversos, not only in Spain, but also with conversos living now in the New World in the coming decades. A number of these different types of cultic apparitions, as people are obviously on a national level struggling with these incredible issues. But what's interesting about Inés of Herrera is that she's prophesying at exactly the same time. Those of you who would remember the 16th century course, I even opened that course with the fact that in the year 1500, there is a prophet wandering around Germany called Asher Lemlein, who is also arguing for redemption, repentance, and so on. So we start to see these two almost identical phenomena happening in two different places. There is some shift happening, not only in the Jewish world, but reverberations happening in the wider world generally, as we are literally, the world is being transformed into what is going to become the modern age. The last ray of hope I will leave you with, apart from the fact that I'm finishing, the last ray of hope that I will leave you with is the fact that the Maharik, if you recall, Rabbi Yosef Kotten Trabuto, had a very, very important student in Italy, who I've spoken about elsewhere, but it's a beautiful point to finish on. And that student was Rabbi Ovadio mi Bartanura, from Bartanura. And following the passing of his teacher, the Maharik, he announced his desire to go and live in a place where people hadn't really gone to live for a while, in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, he arrives in Jerusalem in 1488, and obviously Jerusalem is destitute, Jerusalem is ignorant. There's a few families living there, but we are about to find that the population of Jerusalem is going to go from around about 300 or 400 when the Rabbi Ovadio mi Bartanura arrives. Within 20 years, it's going to be at the level of 7,000 or 8,000 after the influx of Sephardic refugees. And because the Ottoman Empire didn't just go, oh, how stupid Spain is, they're kicking out their Jews. We're trying to build an economy and a society up here because we're a growing empire. We'll gladly have them. They can come here and do what they want to do. They didn't just say all that. They sent ships. They sent ships to pick Jews up and bring them to the Ottoman Empire and settled them in Constantinople, and settled them in Salonika, and settled them in Izmir, and settled them right across the Levant, including in the land of Israel, to build up these economic zones. So as one door closed, another door opened, both in America, but also, not yet, but at least conceptually, but also in the Old World. And Rabbi Ovadia mi Bartanura arrives in Jerusalem, and for the first few decades, almost single-handedly, not only instantly became the rabbi of Jerusalem, but built up that community institution by institution. When he first arrived, he was burying the dead with his own hands. But through his own career, built up Jerusalem to become what Jerusalem was going to be in the 16th and 17th centuries, and eventually on to become the Yishuv that eventually became the capital of the state of Israel. But that rebuilding, that renaissance of Yerushalayim starts with him, and of course he's famous for his commentary on the Mishnah and so on, huge scholar. So that's a point where I want to end. I know that there has been a lot in this talk and in this series I have not been able to speak about, but the great theme that I wanted to illustrate throughout these three talks has been the idea that even in the darkest moments of Jewish history, we have hope and we have faith, and we are moving towards being a part of the world that is ultimately, we pray, a better world, and that project of the Jewish people at the center of making this a better world is ongoing today, and we can learn many, many things from this period. So thank you for listening. I want to just check that I know I'm well over time, but I can see already these notes. There's one person I didn't talk about, just very briefly, way back when I was talking about physicians, the Emperor Yaakov ben Yechiel Loans, who was the physician of the emperor, connects beautifully because, please, I'm asking forgiveness. Please give me a minute, because if I go home and I don't talk about this, I'll be really annoyed, because it's a little ray of hope as well, and it's a nice place to end as well, right at the end of the 1400s. because the texts, the proliferation of Jewish texts and the rise of Hebrew letters and people like Dimela Mirandula in Italy and so on getting interested in Hebrew. And we had a similar phenomenon in Germany, believe it or not, what's called the German Renaissance. Not exactly like the Italian Renaissance, it was like the Renaissance German style, but one of the things that they did was, exactly, they got into Hebrew texts, and of course there was and probably the greatest Hebraist or Hebraic sympathizer was a theologian called Johannes Reuchlin. I have spoken about Reuchlin elsewhere. Now, one of the great fears reverberating in the church at the time, particularly after the advent of printing, was what? Oh no, the Jews are going to print the Talmud. And of course, eventually, you very soon did print the Talmud, but people are wanting to ban the Talmud right throughout the Holy Roman Empire. That would mean that every single copy of the Talmud would be destroyed right across Europe. It would be a massive cataclysm, and they set up an ecumenical council. Is there a ringing noise, or is it just in my head?
It's a ringing noise.
Okay. I just want to make sure it wasn't just happening to me. There's an ecumenical council they set up that was going to investigate this issue, and Reuchlin got himself on that panel, and they all said, terrible, let's ban the Talmud before the Jews print it. And they brought it to Reuchlin, and Reuchlin said, because he was a humanist, and that's the thing to be in the Renaissance, you might not be that fond of Jews, but you're a humanist. And he said, I cannot put my signature to ban a book that I have not read, which is a massive statement of the humanism of the Renaissance, and a huge, and actually it's due to Reuchlin, and he helped Jewish communities in other ways that really enabled then the distribution of Jewish texts and Hebrew letters right throughout Europe. But Reuchlin had been taught Hebrew by Yaakov ben Yechiel Loans, the physician of the Holy Roman Emperor. So the connection of all of these issues show that Jewish communities were working in sync with each other in many, many ways as part of this wider project. The fact that we got through the 14th and 15th centuries is miraculous, but we came out not only in some ways stronger, but with tremendous potential as we launch into the next 500 years of Jewish history, with which we are all so familiar. So thank you very, very much for discussing that.